domain of the variable when given an equation is the set of all numbers such that both sides of the equation are defined. So when is both sides of the equation defined? Well, first of all, let's talk about when it's not defined. We know that an equation, or more specifically an expression, is not defined if you have a 0 in the denominator. Also, we know that an equation is not defined when you have a negative number under the square root. So keeping those two things in mind, let us look at where our equation is defined. Okay, so let's look at our examples. By the way, each one of our examples are a little different, so I suggest you watch until the very end. Also, if there are any videos that I think that you need to know before watching this video, I will leave them down below in the description. Be sure to check out the description. I always leave detailed explanations in my description. Okay, so let us look at our first one. We have 5x minus 4 is equal to 2. When is this equation defined? First, look at the side where you have the variable and ask yourself, if I plug in any number for x, will our equation be defined? Yes, because if I plug in any number from 1, 2, 3, all the way into infinity. Also, if I plug in the number 0 or any negative number, negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, all the way to negative infinity, that equation will be defined, right? So the domain is basically the set of all numbers, okay? So if you're going to write it, sometimes your teacher may want you to write it in interval notation. So if you write it in interval notation, you're going to use a parentheses, say negative infinity to positive infinity, and that is your domain, okay? So that is the domain of the first one. Now let's look at the second one, okay? Now we have a restriction. Remember what we talked about. So we have a square root, and we also have a variable on the left side. Well, first let's look at the left side. The left side, clearly it's a set of all real numbers like this, right? However, the domain of the variable is the set of all numbers such that both sides of the equation are defined. So we want both sides to be defined. So now we have a situation on the right side where we have a square root. And what did we say about square roots? We cannot have a negative number under the square root. So therefore, it has to be the set of all numbers starting from 0 to infinity. So we're going to write a bracket, because a bracket means that we are including 0. Parentheses means we're not actually including. We always write parentheses when we're dealing with infinities. Okay, so starting from 0 to infinity is when both sides of the equation is defined. So that is our domain for the second problem. Let us look at the third problem. What do we say about one of our situations where we cannot have a 0 in the denominator? So we look at x plus 1. We have 1 is equal to 3 over x plus 1, and we do not want a 0 in the denominator. So when is this denominator 0? First, we want to take what's in the denominator and set it equal to 0, solve for x, and see when the denominator equal to 0. Okay, so I'm going to take x plus 1 is equal to 0. By the way, I have already did a video where it explains how to solve for x. So if you do not know how to solve for x, I will leave that video down below in the description, okay? So basically, I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides. So we get x is equal to negative 1. Sure enough, if I were to plug in negative 1 into the variable, negative 1 plus 1 is equal to 0. So we know that this denominator is equal to 0 when x is equal to a negative 1. So we do not want x to equal negative 1. So our domain is from negative infinity to -1 union -1 to infinity. And again, the parentheses means we're not including 1. Now, if I would have put a bracket like we did over here, that means we are including that number. So basically, we can plug in any number from negative infinity up to -1. Union, this little u means union. -1, which we're not including, to the positive infinity. Okay, so that is how you do that problem. Now let's look at this one. Now we have two things we need to consider. We need to consider a 0 in the denominator, and we also need to consider a negative number under the square root. So we don't want those two things to happen. So in this case, we're going to say 0 to infinity. Why? Because we're not including 0 like we did over here. Before we could because it was in the numerator. In this case, we cannot include 0, so we're going to use parentheses. So the domain in this problem is the set of all numbers starting from a little bit above 0 to infinity, right? Because we're not actually including the 0.